All right, good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully this is a good time slot because after this we'll head next door and have some beers. So thanks for attending. I appreciate your attention, and let's go ahead and get started. So essentially what I wanted to do today was focus on a couple of things. About a year ago, a little bit over a year ago, we embarked down the path to decouple our front end architecture from our back end, essentially have a completely headless architecture. Essentially, what started was that we wanted to go responsive. So we had a .com site, and then we had an M. site, which essentially was cumbersome. It was hard to maintain. We had to make changes. We had to do it in two different places. So what I wanted to do today was start with at least the problem statement of what we faced when we went down this path. And then without just jumping into the benefits, I did want to run everyone through what our architecture looks like and what was the thought process behind it. And then I'll talk about the benefits, which is really what I want to focus on. But for some of you who I've spoken to that are considering making this decision, I also do want to highlight a couple of disadvantages because, of course, there are some, and I think it would be helpful to share what those are. And then I'll try to leave some time for Q&A, although we could also do that next door. So essentially we had it was kind of two parts to the problem, right? One, the business was asking for the ability to make changes more rapidly, have a cleaner, more richer user interface, have some flexibility, do some things with interactivity, and then from an IT perspective, which is my team and our group, we obviously wanted to make it a single unified code base. We were also faced with the omni-channel type initiatives. We were also launching multiple sites in Europe, right? So all of those things that we had to plan for were the things that we wanted to sort of address. And so again, as I mentioned, the primary objective was really just build a responsive a website. But essentially what we did was we changed the IT objective. And what we wanted to do is we thought it would be a great opportunity, kind of like when you're moving from one house to another, to do some things architecturally that maybe we wouldn't have the opportunity to do down the line. So these are the things that we sort of added to our problem statement, right? One, we wanted to decouple the presentation layer from the business logic, reduce the level of effort for future enhancements that we knew we were going to have to take on, enable APIs because we knew we didn't have mobile apps a year ago. Right now we have 2. Actually, we have about 4. And a lot of those are leveraging the APIs that we've been able to develop. Again, deliver features faster, and then create an efficient and effective onboarding process for new developers. So at the same time that we sort of started down this path, we also started to think about doing things agile. We started building our own in-house technical expertise, and so we really started to do a lot of things around the same time. So we started throwing all of these things as focus areas for this particular project/initiative. And then, of course, we didn't want to be bound by what ATG provided out of the box or what Endeca was capable of from a user experience perspective. So let me run through real quick what the architecture looks like and some of the decisions that we had to make. So on the left is your typical kind of monolithic ATG architecture, right? Front end sits on top of the back end. It's all one and the same. There are the Endeca, the CSE applications, all the feeds, all the integrations, right? On the right-hand side is really what we moved to. And again, everything below kind of that segregation, we chose not to mess with anything from an integration standpoint, none of the feeds, none of the inventory, all of that stuff we kept exactly the same. Otherwise, we'd probably still be working on this project today. You can kind of see we've built a decoupled universal front-end JavaScript framework that sat on top of kind of an API, what we call an API aggregation layer, which sat on top of ATG. Just to dive into that top part a little bit, essentially we've got 3 components to our architecture today. One is what we call the experience assembler, which is essentially what handles the state management. It's React, it's Redux, and it's Express. And we use Foundation as kind of our responsive design framework. In the middle is what we call our API aggregator or the orchestration layer, which is essentially Loopback, which is an API gateway product. and then we're caching all of those API responses that come from ATG in a Redis database, right? And then, of course, is your ATG, which is doing things like managing state, doing the session management, the cart management, things like that. As we went down that path, the architecture also has additional layers of caching, which I just wanted to quickly highlight. At the top, of course, closest to the user is Akamai. We've got caching that's happening on the React front in what we call the experience assembler. And again, we have caching from an API response perspective stored in Redis. And then, of course, we're leveraging all of the various caches that are out of the box in ATG. So the tech stack really quickly, for those that are interested, Node is what we run our API aggregator on that connects to React. The Redis database I talked about, React, Redux, and Deca for the template provider, and then of course ATG, and we've built a number of REST components and API services on top of ATG. All right, now for the fun stuff. So I'm going to jump into the benefits. The benefits basically fall into three categories, right? One is essentially testing and release management, right? So there are advantages across the board to this architecture. They fall into testing and release management, performance and scalability, and then of course from a software development standpoint. So I'll cover those three categories. From a testing and release management standpoint, definitely, again, single code base, right? Last year, in the last 12 months, we've launched sites that address the needs of 20 countries in Europe, right? 8 to 10 different languages, a variety of 3 or 4 different currencies. And so being able to standardize our code base to deliver functionality to all of those different regions was huge, right? Because it minimizes our overhead and all the maintenance issues that we could potentially run into. It also enables us to build functionality. Everything that we do is primarily focused on North America and more specifically for the US. And so what we've been doing is trying to find ways where we build functionality and enable all of the other regions to take advantage of it, right? So click and collect, buy online, pick up in store. Built it for the US, launched it in the US, but it's now functionality that Canada can say, all right, Nick, we want to turn this on. So we basically can enable it, have them test it, do any validation that has to occur, fix things, and then roll it out, right? And so the idea is that we should be able to do that for all of the other regions in Europe as well. We definitely had issues around multiple devices, multiple operating systems, and multiple browser versions, right? So the single code base and this decoupled architecture, because it's new, because it's advanced, and it kind of somehow manages to keep pace with all of these things that are always changing, it's definitely made it a lot easier for us to keep pace with all of those things that are constantly changing. We also have separate releases. So I was telling somebody today that we had a bug last week, a production issue, that was isolated to a JavaScript fix. By the time we identified what the issue was, we were able to fix it in a couple of hours, we deployed it, we tested it, and it was in production in less than 24 hours. That may sound like a long time, but if you look at what we've done previously, we don't have to build a brand new EAR file, put it in a testing environment, schedule our service provider to do that deployment, have people lined up over the night. We literally could push things out, and these front-end releases that we do happen in a matter of minutes, right? So as long as you've got the right controls around it, it's very simple, it's very easy, and it's all tightly integrated with our software development process. The testing folks love it. We can fix things, they're very isolated, they don't introduce larger regression issues where you've got to do full validations of the site. So there's definitely a lot more advantages from a regression testing perspective. And then I think, this last bullet is kind of a double-edged sword. There's a lot of tools out there that are kind of emerging that enable us to do things that we've never been able to do with just the ATG stack. And so the number of tools out there for testing and for validation and for performance tuning and isolating issues, there's a ton of stuff that we've never had before, and I think that's a great advantage. But I'll also talk about how that could also be a disadvantage a little bit later. Performance and scalability. So if you look at our site, it's definitely, from an experience standpoint, a lot faster, right? There's this idea with single-page applications that first hit is obviously a little bit more costlier than subsequent hits, but that's because we're sending information out to the user's browser that is then stored for all subsequent interactions in that session, right? So there are things like filters that just behave super fast, right? If you navigate from one category to another category, if you go to the site, you'll see that only the things that need to be refreshed are refreshed. The header stays the same, the footer stays the same, the filters on the left stay the same. All of those things carry from one click to the next, right? And so it really enables the user to experience a faster load time as they're navigating through the site. Again, easy to debug. So if you look, like Chrome is amazing, right? Like we all have these expectations that we should be able to find issues. Because React is JavaScript based and there's a ton of development tools out there, it is actually easier for developers to build code and to debug their own code because of all the tools that exist just within Chrome alone, let alone all the other tools that exist in the market. And then I think the last one is from a scalability standpoint. I mean, if we wanted additional servers, or if we need to ramp up for the front end for that experience assembler component, they're all node instances with like 2 gigs of RAM, single CPU, multiple CPU, it doesn't matter, right? These are very inexpensive machines. We can spin them up in the cloud, we can scale. They're very elastic, right? They don't need huge bare metal servers. They're not massive machines that are required to run sort of the front end components of it. And so in that regard, it really enables us to scale pretty easily and in a very cost-effective manner. All right, software development. So this is where, as we sort of have built up our own in-house capacity to work with some of our SI partners, we're really able to realize some of these aspects of the benefits of our new architecture. Definitely a lot more flexibility. We have a UX team, we have a UI team. We work very closely with them, and we're able to really identify very early on in the process what's technically feasible and what's not technically feasible. But there's a lot more that we can do with React that we either couldn't do before or were very cumbersome and time-consuming with just an ATG platform. Again, iterative development. So because we're working very closely with our business partners, we're able to do things like build prototypes, proof of concepts. We've actually gotten to the point where when we're building functionality, we've trained the business to kind of think along the lines of MVP, right? What do you want? What do you absolutely need to have? And then in a subsequent sprint or a subsequent release, let us evolve that, right? Let us make it more sophisticated. Let's build it out along the way. And I think this platform and this architecture that we're on really enables us to take advantage of that more so than what you would do, when you're kind of under the hood with ATG. It also enables us to do things like, because of the way React is kind of architected, we build components, right? So when you hit the home page, there's a light box that asks you if you want to join our marketing, sign up for our marketing information, right? That light box is a React component. If we want to delay the rendering of that light box, we can. If we want to launch it from the shopping cart, if we want to launch it from the sign-in page, wherever we want to invoke that component, we now have that flexibility, and it's a lot more simpler and faster than, say, rewriting some code or changing the code on the page where we wanted to invoke that. And the same applies with APIs, right? We've really, we've built a lot of APIs that have enabled us to expose them externally for other uses, not just for the site. And I'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later. Attracting developers and presenting opportunities to learn. So as we try to grow our team, one of the things that we're finding, again, this is a double-edged sword as well, because there aren't a lot of React.js developers out there. But there's a lot of people who are actually, a lot of people in the software development community who are interested in learning React, who want to be challenged, and who are actually, interested in working at a place like Michael Kors as opposed to going and working at a startup, right? Those are the issues we run into, is like, well, yeah, I don't really want to do enterprise software development at a big company like Michael Kors. I'd rather go work at this startup. We're based in New York City, right? So we're faced with that constant challenge of how do we attract talent, how do we acquire talent, and how do we retain talent? And I think the new architecture definitely is a draw, and we found a lot of people who wouldn't normally be interested in working in a large company like Michael Kors or working in an environment like Michael Kors are now obviously like very, very interested because of the tech stack. And I think that's a huge thing. It's a huge advantage and a huge plus. And then the parallel development. Before it was an ATG developer, right? Now you can do things like we're going to build Apple Pay, for example, right? The front end guys have already started on it. They can stub out the API responses while the back end guys are doing the integration to CyberSource, right? This development is happening in parallel. At some point it will converge and they'll merge the code together and they'll connect it. But at least we have the opportunity to make a lot of progress while one guy is figuring out how to do the back end development. The front end guy is actually making progress and getting things to a good state. And then again, I think you'll hear me harp a lot about the control over the user experience and the user interface. But in today's world, people are used to using things like Airbnb and Uber, where stuff just works, right? The users don't have to think. If you look at Airbnb and Uber, whether you're in-app or Airbnb on the web, it's obvious where you need to type. It's obvious where you have to put in a date. Things refresh. Things are like suggestions are provided to you. All of those things are very intuitive, and that's the user base that we now have to cater to that we didn't have to before. Before, browse a category, find a product, put it in your cart, make the checkout frictionless, and things would be fine. Now we actually have to compete with people that are using Amazon and Uber and Airbnb, right? And so we're trying to find ways where the filters and the refreshing and things are just intuitive and those recommendations are provided to them so that it's a very guided process and people can actually shop without having to figure out where they should be tapping or clicking. There's some things there that you can kind of read about if you're interested. Other components that are really advantages to this architecture. We talked a little bit about Marriott at lunch and translation. That's a huge thing for us. With this architecture, we've been able to integrate to translation proxies and translation memory and things like that so much more seamlessly, much more reliably, and being able to test those things in a more rapid format has been instrumental. And we would have never been able to do that without this architecture. Essentially, all of those things that I listed under third parties really is a testament to the fact that all of these technologies that are kind of evolving and emerging, they're all based on JavaScript. And if you have a front end that is based on JavaScript, it's just so much more easier to plug and play. It's kind of like, it's an assumed, like this is how we're going to do it. Rarely do we engage with a third party and we're like, all right, well, we got to figure it out. It's like, here's a spec, here's some JSON, here are the API keys, let me know if you have any questions. Just kind of pick it up, run with it, and it gets done. And so I can tell you a year ago, before we had this architecture, we would have to iterate and we would have to figure out, and things would be very much around feeds, right? We'll send you this file, you send me that file, we'll process it, we'll FTP it, all of that kind of stuff, which was very error prone and unreliable. Now these things are just happening. Like developers pick up specs, they develop, things get integrated, and we move on. We have more time to focus on larger, more strategic initiatives because we're not messing around with just trying to exchange data and figure out how we want to make that handshake. There is an extensive developer community. Again, this is a double-edged sword too, and I'll talk about it in the disadvantages, but things are constantly evolving. Node has a number of NPM modules that come out all the time. You can plug and play things, you can test them out, and there are things that we have the ability to take advantage of without actually doing any work. We just have to kind of do some research. And there's tons of developers out there and open source community of people who really want to just contribute and evolve the platform and are expecting nothing in return. And then the last piece is really kind of says a lot about where we are in terms of our digital initiatives and what we're focused on. We've recently, so we have an API gateway in this architecture, but we also have an enterprise API gateway that connects to ATG. So whenever people are saying, we need a Google shopping feed from you guys, fine, we'll give you an API key. Here's how you can go connect to it, you pick it up, right? So we've got the ability to do some of these enterprise integration projects much more rapidly than we've ever been able to do before. We've built an associate app in Europe, so we've got a few hundred stores where associates now have the ability to walk around with an iPad and say, you wanted that blouse, we don't have it here, but let me find it for you and we'll ship it to you. That associate app is built on the exact same APIs that we use for our .com and .eu and Canadian sites, right? Those APIs are the exact same ones where they're processing payments, managing the shopping cart, authenticating users, et cetera. And then we've got a number of internal applications. In our stores, we used to have little postcards while you're waiting in line to pay for something where we used to walk up to a customer and say, do you want to sign up to our marketing program? We've replaced that with iPads where people are standing in line. We've given them iPads. Those iPads that are signing people up are using the exact same APIs connecting through the API gateway that we've exposed. So this architecture really lends itself to doing a number of different things from a pure digital standpoint, besides just all of the other flexible features that I pointed out on the .com site. All right, there are some disadvantages, and I think they're worth noting. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about them, but as you go down this process, for those of you that are considering it, these are the things you need to think about, right? Like our team definitely, admittedly took a gamble, right? React, running a .com site that is supposed to be, if we have an issue, we would either call our managed service provider or we would call Oracle. Easy problem, right? Something's not working, let me pick up the phone, let me scream at somebody and get somebody to fix it. Guess what? Can't do that, right? There's a problem. We have to sort of go through the process of elimination and identify, well, is this a network problem? Is this a node problem? Is this a React problem? Like, we can't pick up the phone and call somebody and scream and yell and expect them to respond. We still have some of that, right? But because of where we've put ourselves, we've kind of doubled down on our own ability to resolve these issues and really track down what the problem is. So that's kind of, bullet 1 and bullet 3. And then bullet 2 is lack of experienced resources. There are no guys out there that have 6 years of React or 5 years of React, because React is like 18 months old or 2 years old, right? So you're not talking about, I have guys that are rock stars, but they're rock stars because they've been doing it for 6 months, right? That's all they've done for the last 6 months. And that's really what a React rock star is. A Node rock star is no different, right? It's somebody who is just resourceful. They know how to figure stuff out. They know how to research. They know how to troubleshoot. But they don't have years and years and years of experience or skills in these technologies, right? And so, again, you kind of have to be cognizant that that's kind of what you have to be okay with if you're going to do that. If you go back and you look at the tech stack that I showed you, right, it's pretty complicated. Let me just go back and pull it up real quick. This is the tech stack, right? So if there's a problem, it could be an Akamai problem. I've got 2 different web servers where I'm running Nginx, Apache. I've got a React layer. I've got a Redux layer. I've got 2 different versions of Node running 2 different applications. And I haven't even gotten to ATG yet. Forget about ATG and Endeca. I'm not even there yet, right? Let alone the database. So if you look, this is a fairly complicated architecture. And so when you run into issues, it's going to take time, right? You have to get to the point, and we're just now getting to that. This will be our first holiday season on this architecture. And so, we're really gearing up to try and figure out how we best monitor and do all the alerting so that we're not super exposed. But to a certain extent, yes, we are exposed, right? We're somewhat vulnerable. More infrastructure to manage. So again, this was the double-edged sword where I said we could spin up VMs. But the reality is I've got experienced assembler instances running on one set of virtual machines. I've got API aggregators running on another set of virtual machines. I've got Redis caching running on another set of machines. And then I've got an aux instance, a CSC instance. I've got multiple ATG instances. I've got European instances, right? So if you kind of look at like an architecture diagram or our network topology, it's pretty scary, right? And it's a lot to manage. It's not easy by any means. And so just something to be aware of as you consider kind of going down this path. Development skill sets. Again, I need a React. To build anything, I need a React guy or gal, I need a Node guy or gal, and I need ATG folks, right? Before, an ATG developer is an ATG developer, right? Yes, some have expertise in different parts of the application, but if I want to build any new functionality, at the bare minimum, I need 3 very different skill sets, right? And so your team is going to be a little bit more diverse than it was or it has been in the past. We manage the source code differently, and it's just just another complication, right? Because we have 2 different types of code deployments. It could be a front-end deployment. It could be a back-end deployment. The code is managed in 2 different places, and so it just creates a little bit more complexity as you're doing deployments. And then again, Node and React. Like if you find documentation, let me know. I'd love to see it. But that's also why the community offsets that a little bit. But when you're in a bind or you're in a jam and you need to figure something out, there's no manual. There's nobody to call, right? So you better have your skill set, your in-house skill set ramped up and at a point where you're comfortable being able to troubleshoot and problem solve. But I will say, to offset some of these disadvantages, I didn't talk about monitoring. All of the major monitoring tools out there are extremely robust for this architecture. So we get a lot of visibility into, what inventory calls are taking a long time, or what pages are loading longer than they normally would be, what API responses are taking longer than usual. We get a lot of advanced visibility through the monitoring tools that we've employed, and I think they've been built around these kind of JavaScript frameworks and this architecture, and they do a fairly good job of giving us advanced visibility to things that might look unhealthy or that are a little bit off the norm. Constantly evolving. I think this is an area where we're already behind on Node.js version, right? There are like security patches and bug fixes and things like that. I don't know what that cycle is yet, but I can tell you that it's a lot shorter than we like. We don't really have the appetite to be patching servers and managing version numbers and keeping pace with the new versions that are occurring, but it's what we signed up for, and it's just something that we have to do that we didn't have to do so much of in the past. And then the last bullet is, developing new features. I talked about the fact that it requires 3 different skill sets. It does take longer to build new features. Although it could be offset a little bit because things can happen in parallel, but there's a lot more collaboration that has to happen amongst the different developers than if you had 2 ATG guys sitting in a dark room drinking Mountain Dew, right? They could bang it out. But now you've got a front-end guy who's relying on the API guy to make sure the API responses are getting aggregated and getting sent to him the way he's expecting. The API guy is talking to the ATG guy and saying, look, here's what I'm going to pass you, here's what I'm expecting you to pass back to me. You know, if there's any like fallout between that conversation and that communication, the React guy is just kind of twiddling his thumbs. He's like, yo man, where are we at? Come on, I got to get this done. So there is somewhat of a dependency, and the interconnectedness of the different development efforts makes it a little bit more, it's just increased effort to build stuff. But maintainability and bug fixing and things like that, I think, like far outweigh the cost. So from a cost benefit standpoint, again, it's just something you should be aware of. That's pretty much it. So I wanted to, I've had conversations today. I wanted to leave ample time for questions, or we can start drinking early, whatever. Yeah.
I have 2 questions.
Sure.
Did your URLs change as part of this architecture revamp? And the second question is, you talked about the skill sets being different. One of the promises of JavaScript that I've heard is that resources are more commodity priced than the rarer, deep ATG guru skill set. Have you seen that to be true, or has there been more JavaScript resources that offsets whatever cost savings?
So the URL change was a business requirement that they couldn't change. So they didn't change. Certain categories disappeared. So we lost some SEO juice, is what I like to call it. We lost some SEO juice from some categories going away. But for the most part, the URLs stayed the same. The JavaScript developer skill set is an interesting one. Because we're still employing ATG, it is easier to find JavaScript developers. It is difficult to find JavaScript developers that know React. When we went through this and we did some code analysis, it's evident that the React code that we produce was written by Java developers. And so we're kind of dealing with that aftermath now. It's not bad, it's just certain things weren't implemented in a React-ish kind of way. It is easy to find JavaScript developers because we're in New York City. Unfortunately, our technology team is in New Jersey.
New Jersey.
I can't get people to cross that river. It's like another country. It's like, yeah, I won't say anything, but I was going to say something could have been politically incorrect. But it's hard to get people, but it is easy to find JavaScript developers. So for example, I've hired 2 junior JavaScript developer guys that are like, I don't really know a lot of React, but I know JavaScript really well. And so as we went through the interview process, we assessed them. As long as I've got a couple of senior guys, those junior guys will be just fine in 4 to 6 months, right? So I think that's the benefit, is that it is commoditized. People know JavaScript. They may not know React, but I think it's easier for them to get there than, say, an Endeca skill set, right? Or an ATG. Like if you don't know the droplet cache, right? Or if you don't know how to implement certain things in ATG, you could really do some harm. In JavaScript, that's the other thing. Like we're rapidly developing, we find issues. That's okay, because we can fix those issues in a day, or we can fix those issues in a couple of days, right? The worst that we're gonna do is a filter is gonna be broken, or an image is gonna be broken, or something that should be displayed in Spanish is being displayed in Italian. Fine, we fix it, we get over it, right? It was a lot more detrimental when we were entirely ATG, because if you broke something, you likely broke it pretty bad, right? And it was something that required more time to fix, more testing to validate, and more time to deploy. And so I think we're in a better place. Any other questions?
We are, we talked earlier.
Yeah.
So it is, we are also building APIs and for the .com site as well as our mobile apps. just one thing what I recently learned going into this path is the way React expects the API response versus what the mobile app. Since React doesn't refresh the whole thing, you don't need to send the whole API response back. You can just send what's changed. But from app world, it's totally different. So how are you maintaining the different versions? How do you make it the same for all your apps and your?
That's what the API aggregator does. Yeah, it does the transformations, right? So you're right. React expects the API response a specific way. That API aggregator that we've put in the middle does a lot of things for us, like the throttling and things like that. But we're basically transforming the API response for React, and then most of our apps, we're building it to try and do as much reusability, but we're also doing API versioning to address issues that happen specific to what you described.
Just to follow on, just from security perspective, how do you make your API more secure? And also just to, I think it's mostly, you mentioned it, like you have multiple, you could add more Node.js instances, but did you have to go through a resizing effort based on old architecture and new architecture?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, we had to go through a significant resizing, and it took us a while to get it down. And admittedly, I don't even know if we're sized properly for holiday. We've been fine since we went live, but we talked about, I was in the load testing session earlier, right? We talked about load testing, and we've load tested we actually built a complete mirror of our production environment, and we load tested that before we launched on this architecture. We have to do the same thing where we load test between now and the end of October or whatever to make sure that we're properly sized for holiday. The problem is that we've got so many layers of caching. There's also like a lot of potential points of failure. So we don't have that problem figured out. It's something that we have to work through and still get there. But it's a good question. Yeah.
Any hopes that this can become a productized type of the whole decoupling thing can be solved? I know that Michael Kors is not in that line of business.
Sure.
But, it just seems like it's something that should be available, at least at best from Oracle itself.
Yeah, I mean, you can ask the Oracle guys or, the number of SI partners here that probably would like to package it up but it's hard, right? First of all, like this effort, I will kid you not, was hard. Like we racked our brains out on the architecture. As you can see, there's no reason to have two different types of web servers, right? Like there are some things that we need to clean up. There are some things that are redundant. No plans for us to productize it, but I can tell you that this is the platform for the future of Michael Kors. Right? We have mobile apps writing on this. We've got other consumers. Anybody who wants data from us, Facebook gets data from us, Google gets data from us, all of those third-party pixels, all of those things, they're all leveraging this architecture, right? And to your point about sizing, I don't even know what those consumers are going to do to my sizing because I haven't even factored them in. When I load tested, I didn't load test throwing in an extra 10% or 20% for external consumers. I didn't even factor that into my sizing. But I can tell you that this is the platform, some of the things, without getting into too much detail, that we're doing are pretty awesome. We have to compete with people like Bonobos who kick ass from an e-commerce perspective because it's just their usability is there, their performance is there, their site just does stuff, right? So we have issues like analytics, translation. We've got globalization in Korea, China, and Japan that we have to tackle. This is our platform that's going to enable us to overcome all of those challenges. So productize it outside of Michael Kors, no, but this is really like the nucleus of what's going to be running all of our digital efforts moving forward.
You mentioned that up there, A/B testing, personalization, and of course decoupling. This is going to make it a lot more friendly with the more modern architectures. How do you leverage that so far? Like, how has that changed now that you have the flexibility to do a lot more with the testing and
That's a good question. So we use Monotate. I don't know if anybody else here used Monotate. Yeah. Yeah. So they've been really, so we do server-side rendering and we do client-side rendering. The challenge with that is before this architecture, Monotate could just rewrite something on the page and like change the description. Well, not anymore, because the server-side rendering is going to say, hey, somebody's trying to change something on the client and I didn't approve that. This doesn't line up with my rendering of the page. Somebody over here is trying to change something, right? So if you employ this architecture, that is potentially a limitation where you used to just, ratings and reviews, Bazaar Voice will just give you a script tag, put it on the page, boom, you're done. Not anymore, right? But Monotate, as an example, is one of numerous partners that have said, hey, what you guys are doing is really cool. We want to change. We've always had it on our roadmap to have A/B testing through an API-driven approach. So we've been working with their product team to actually accelerate that, so it's something we can take advantage of. The same goes with our translation partner. They're like, that's what all of our clients are going to be doing. We want to work with you guys to advance our product roadmap to try and address that, right? So some of these things are issues because a lot of people, that's why it's a disadvantage too, is because I can't just go to Monotate and be like, give me the API so we can plug it in. Their immediate response was, what API? We don't have it. There's like a plugin that you use to like rewrite stuff on your site, and it's fantastic, and the business loves it because if they don't get a build fast enough, they just accomplish it in Monotate, right? They can't do that anymore because of the server-side rendering component of it. But the API-driven approach is something that everybody in the industry, all of our third-party vendors are embracing. If they're not there, they're trying to get there. And I think what we're doing is a driver to that. But again, I'll tell you, we had numerous challenges because we didn't account for that in our project plan. We just thought things would just work, right? We didn't think about that as we were going through the implementation. It was kind of like a gotcha at the end, and we're like, oh, shit, I guess we have to fix this. But again, it's getting better. The adoption is getting there for all of these other parties.
I just want to add on from our experience, the tool that we use expected a JSON object. So it expected to be in the API, and we were in the old JSP, so we used to have a hidden JSP that actually forms the JSON, and now they can use the API response directly and get rid of that layer. So kind of helpful for us.
One of the things I didn't talk about is SEO. So this is actually better for SEO. The whole site is HTTPS. It's just what Google looks for, right? Like if you're not in Google's good graces, you're a step behind, right? So this has been advantageous from an SEO perspective that we're kind of seeing it takes a few months or it takes a couple of months to actually see the uplift, but we're now kind of seeing the fruits of that labor starting to pay off. All right, great. Thanks for your time. Let's grab a drink.